Hello, and thank you for listening to Begonia Banter, episode 4. I am Kristen from at BegoniaSarawak on Instagram, and this episode is going to be a start to finish process on importing plants. Well, I should say how I import plants, and also why some plants are more expensive than others and plant pricing in general. And so I have quite a bit of experience on importing and exporting plants. I think I'm going to make a future episode on exporting plants just because it's a little bit more in depth because I am the exporting entity instead of the importing entity. So let's just go through a brief overview on the steps on how a plant arrives in the United States. And as a disclaimer, this is just from my experience, although I have imported maybe 15 or so shipments, so I'm obviously not an expert, but I do know my way around a little bit. I like to think so. So, in general, a brief overview of how plants arrive in the United States, which is where I live. So, first, you need to source the plant. You have to go on a website, you're Googling, maybe you know somebody who knows somebody that possibly has a plant. In general, you have to locate the plant. You have to source the plant. I have gone a few different routes. I've gone through individual people. I've also gone through websites. To me, there's not really a difference in terms of ease on how the process goes. I don't mind not going through a company. Some people feel more comfortable going through a company, such as a website. I think it gives them a sense of buyer's protection going through a website. I don't really care about that because I myself don't have a website and I am a reputable source of plants. So I'm not going to judge someone if they don't have, an official fancy website, because I don't have an official fancy website. So I don't mind either way, but I know some people, you probably have more, I don't know what the term is, rights or, just a sense of security if you go through a website versus just an individual person. So number 1 is sourcing the plant. To me, this is the most difficult step, and it happens to be step number 1 because if you're looking for a very, I will use the term rare plant, it's going to be difficult to source because odds are you probably, if it's that rare, you probably can't just Google the name and find somebody who is selling it. You kind of have to network and establish your own connections on other exporters of plants in other countries, etc. So developing that network in the beginning, to me, it wasn't necessarily hard, it was just time consuming. Now it's a bit easier for me to source plants because I already have established connections in multiple different countries. So it's a bit easier for me to do it now, but still, if it's some crazy rare unicorn plant, odds are I'm probably not going to get it, even with my network of sources. But let's just pretend for the sake of this podcast that we happen to go through our network and we are able to source the plant. And mind you, this process can sometimes take months. On multiple occasions, plants that I've imported, some of them have taken upwards of 4 months to actually find the plant, not receive the plant, but find someone or a website, find a source that has the plant that I want. So to me, it's the most tedious step. It's obviously the most important step because if you can't locate the plant, you can't import it. And it takes the most amount of time, energy, all that kind of stuff. So number one, you have to source the plant. Number two, you have to agree on a price. If you're going through a website, you're probably just going to pay whatever the website says. If you happen to talk to just an individual person, perhaps you can negotiate price a little bit. I sometimes will negotiate the price, but as I've gotten more into the business side of things, I don't do that anymore, or at least I don't do it as aggressively as I used to, because I understand that everyone has to make money, right? So who am I to say that a price isn't adequate because they have something that I want? So if I want it, I have to pay their price. And that's just business 101, right? Supply and demand. If somebody has something that you want, they can say whatever price that they want. And if you won't pay it, someone else will. So I have learned not to really negotiate, but I was brought up to be a little bit on the cheaper side, so I try to get a good price. But now like I said, I'll still do it occasionally. I just won't do it as aggressively as, let's say, I used to in the past or when I was first starting out. So till you agree on a price or you come to some sort of negotiation on a price. At this point, as the importer, you don't really have a whole lot to do right now because you found the plant and you paid for the plant. Now it's up to the exporter to do their part properly, according to laws and regulations, and then you just have to receive the plant. So how that process goes is the exporter, which is the person who has the plant that you want, will have to get a phyto certificate. Now, usually phyto certificates in other countries are I've found personally that they're a bit cheaper than the United States phyto certificates. Now, obviously every country is different, right? I'm pretty sure that phyto certificates in Indonesia, for example, are way more expensive than a phyto certificate from Malaysia or from Japan or another country. So it kind of just depends on whatever the phyto certificate is. You're going to have to pay for it because if you're importing a plant from another country, you have to have a phytosanitary certificate. Now, what happens if you don't have a phytosanitary certificate is you're basically rolling the dice on whether the United States Customs Department will destroy your package or not. I know whatever importing state the package is coming into, so as an example, let's say you live in Texas and you're importing a plant from Japan. The package is not going to go directly from Japan to Texas. It's most likely going to stop in California to do a customs inspection because that's the port of arrival into the country, and then the package will be sent from California to Texas. That's just a brief example. So you are risking the package being destroyed if you don't have the proper documentation for the plant. Now, the phytosanitary certificate is a certificate that ensures the plant's health, that it doesn't have any diseases, it doesn't have any pests, it's overall in good health, it doesn't have any chemicals or disease that you're bringing into the United States of America that could affect our agriculture and our plants here. It's basically just a safety measure, but you have to have this official documentation if you want to ensure that your plant is actually going to arrive to you, you kind of need the official documentation. Now, as I was saying before, certain ports of arrival, which are usually on the coast of the United States of America, different states will be more strict versus less strict on paperwork and things like that. I believe it's more strict if it's an agricultural state. So Florida, California, I'm trying to think of something else, South Carolina probably, whatever is considered an agricultural state, those ports of entries are going to be more strict on official paperwork and having all the necessary documentation than, let's say, a port in Maine, because that's not an agricultural state. That's just my experience. I don't know if that's true for all of the ports of entry, but I've lived in a few different states, and it's been night and day different depending on where I've lived. And I've lived in non-agricultural states my whole life. This is the first time that it's actually the second time I'm living in a agricultural state, and it's completely different. So in theory, you could risk not having a phytosanitary certificate if you live in Maine, let's just say as an example, because the port of entry is going to be quote unquote less strict. Now, I personally wouldn't advise that. I think it is reckless if you're importing plants without the necessary paperwork, because without the necessary paperwork, you don't actually know if the plant has pests or some kind of weird disease or fungal infection, and that can actually harm other plants and the nature that we have here. So I personally think it's reckless if you import without the proper paperwork. So I just suggest getting the proper paperwork. And if you're importing from someplace like Malaysia, the phyto certificates are literally $5. So in my opinion, it's not really, that's an estimate. It's extremely cheap. So to me, it's not really a reason to not get one. But that is on the exporting person's responsibility to get the appropriate paperwork. They should know what paperwork goes with your shipment. I have noticed with other countries, with obtaining the phyto certificate, it tends to take a little bit longer than what it takes here. I don't know. It's probably just because they have more volume of exporting plants, because a lot of the times you are importing plants from tropical places, right? So in general, other people are buying their plants from tropical places. So it's probably just volume. The amount of orders that for this phyto certificate that they get is just, there's more of them to do. So it just takes a little bit longer. So if you're planning on actually importing a plant, sometimes it can take, 2.5, 3 weeks to actually kind of get the ball rolling. So it's not, a lot of the times, at least in my experience, it's not exactly a fast or speedy, efficient process. It usually takes some time. So you have to practice your patience a little bit. Okay, so next step, number 4, will be package the plant. So once the other person, you find somebody that has the plant, you agree on a price, they get the phyto certificate. Like I mentioned before, it sometimes can take weeks to get, but let's just say that they got the phyto certificate, then they just package the plant appropriately, hopefully, and ship it to you. That's 4 and 5 would be package and ship. Now, number 6, your package arrives at a port entry. Those are, like I mentioned before, usually on the coasts of the country. So for me, I live in southern Florida, and our port of entry is Miami. So every single package that is imported has to go through Miami's port of entry. And the importing officers will look at the package, they'll look at your paperwork, make sure everything is fine. I have heard, this hasn't happened to me personally, but I have heard that there are times when the paperwork can be fine and they still deem a package necessary for either quarantine or removal. So even if you have all of the appropriate paperwork, it sometimes can still not be enough, quote unquote, because I don't know, for whatever reason, the importing officers find something that might not be right with the plant or what have you, and they say that it needs to go to quarantine. Now, I have read from my USDA contact that sometimes this quarantine process, if they see fit, can take like 2 weeks. And if you think about it, you're most likely buying a sensitive terrarium plant that's just been shipped in a plane, going through all sorts of ruckus, then got in a truck, now is in a importing office, and now it has to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And these people that work in the importing office are not professionals when it comes to plants. To be honest, they don't really care about your package too much. So they're not exactly gentle. They're not exactly giving the best situation to a terrarium plant. It's not like they're babying this thing and putting it in its absolute, perfect greenhouse conditions. Absolutely not. They're just doing what needs to be done according to their rules and regulations, right? So there are times when a package could be quarantined. It can take up to 2 weeks. And if they still, for whatever reason, see that there's an issue with the package, they can destroy the package, and you will get either a phone call from the shipping company, or you'll get a letter in the mail for an update on your package that it has been, incinerated. So I don't wish that upon anyone. It doesn't sound like a good process. But even if, let's say, you go through all of the necessary process, blah, 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 your plant could still be quarantined. And when you import plants, it's kind of one of those things where it's like you don't believe it till you see it. And that's what I have learned is I don't believe that the plant is mine until it's actually been delivered to my house, because there's so many things that can go wrong. And it's a bit of stress. It's time and it's stress. It's energy. It's everything. It's not for the faint of heart. That's why it's not my personal favorite to import plants. I'd rather buy from someone in the United States just because it's easier. It's 100% easier, in my opinion. But I also like importing plants because you get the plants that you want specifically and that are new, quote unquote, new to the hobby and new to cultivation. So obviously there's pros and cons. This video is not about pros and cons, but anywho's, so the last step is, if it potentially doesn't need quarantine, then the last step is obviously it arrives to your house and you have to acclimate it in your home. And depending on whatever kind of journey that the plant has had will depend on how you acclimate the plant, how long you acclimate the plant, how you decide to rehab the plant. It's all dependent on the journey that the plant has had. And I've had a plant that was imported, and it literally it was like 4.5 or 5 months for it to actually get settled. So And it's like that whole time, it's on the brink, right? Like it's on the brink of death. And it's just it can be such a stressful process because it's like you obviously have this time investment into the plant, you have a money investment into the plant, and then, it's just teetering on the brink of death potentially, and it's just stress. So, yeah, it can be a very stressful process. But the acclimation, I would say on average, if I'm importing a plant, for it to fully acclimate, it'll usually take me about 2 months. And when I first get the plants, I will immediately take a leaf propagation, if applicable. Sometimes you get a very tiny plant and it's not applicable, but I will immediately take a leaf cutting, and fingers crossed that everything will be okay. But there's been multiple times where I've imported plants, and thank goodness I took a leaf propagation, because the initial plant completely died because of these are live things, and it's a stressful time for them too. And so, I don't know, just the original plant will die and I'll only have the propagation left. So yeah, it can be a stressful, actually, I won't say it can be. To me, it is a stressful process. Like I said before, I don't believe it until I actually have the plant in my hand, because there's so many things that can go wrong. So that's basically the overview of importing a plant, of getting a plant into the United States. You have to source the plant, potentially agree on a price, get a phyto certificate, package, ship, potentially quarantine, and then acclimate. So it's 7 steps. And kind of touched upon this, but pricing and why some plants are expensive. Now, expensive is a relative term, right? Because one thing can be expensive to somebody, and the same exact price cannot be expensive to someone else. So I'm using the term loosely here. I'm saying expensive as in a few $100s. That seems like a pretty universal kind of expensive plant to me. I could be wrong, but I'm just saying, some people think a $70 plant is expensive, and some people think a $500 plant is expensive. So when I'm in general talking about why are some plants expensive, in my head I'm thinking a few $100s, but obviously it can be more, it can be less. It's just a relative term. But I think everybody can kind of understand. I don't want to go into, explaining business to everyone, because I think it's a logical, pretty simple, what am I trying to say? I don't want to explain business to people, because to me it's very simple and logical. And why plants are expensive versus others, it has to do with the time invested in the plant, sourcing the plants. Like I said, sometimes it can take months, it could take 6 months, it could take 4 months, it could take 2 weeks, but it's utilizing your network. If you don't have a network and you're starting from scratch, you're trying to reach out to an email, a bajillion different people. Most of them don't even respond to you. But in general, it's the time you took to source the plants, the conversations, all of the WhatsApp, all of the phone calls, all of the emails you're dealing with people in different time zones. So you're answering texts at, 2 a.m. And so it's the time it took you to source the plant. That's number one. Number two is the rarity of the plant. Is it a quote unquote new, rare plant into the hobby? Is kind of, we talked about it briefly before, but it's supply and demand. So is it a plant that everybody wants? Is it a plant that's super popular right now? That is obviously going to play a huge factor into the price of the plants. Another one is it if it's already in circulation in the United States? I use that one a lot in my pricing. If I've already seen it pop up here and there in America, I'll price it lower than something that I know has not been in circulation, or to the best of my knowledge has not been in circulation. That will be priced at a higher number. So, right, supply and demand. How many of this product are there, right? If there's more, it's going to be less. If there's less, it's going to be more money. But I would say overall, in general, the import risk factors in heavily into the pricing of a plant. So if somebody has imported this plant and gone through all of the time, energy, stress, blah, 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 to get this plant into the United States, and then they took on all of the risk, right? Like they took on all of the risk of getting this plant. They risked the plant being quarantined for 2 weeks in the Miami port of entry. They risked getting scammed from some random person in wherever. They, paid for the original phytosanitary certificate. And, what else? They paid for shipping. They paid to, not physically, but they, paid in the sense of time to acclimate that original plant, and risked that original plant dying, losing all of their money investment in getting that plant here. So importing risk is huge when it comes to pricing. But I would say that those are pretty much the main ones to me in terms of pricing. Again, we'll just go over it, how, the time necessary it took to source the plant, the rarity of it, if it's in circulation already, and the original importing risk. And I think this goes without saying. I probably don't even have to say this because I think everyone kind of gets it at this point, but you really shouldn't be price shaming anyone. And this is not just with plants. I think it goes with anything, because you don't actually know what that business, like what their investment into that product is. And you're just seeing the final result, right? So you have no concept of what is the actual investment into that product. And I think in 2023, we should not be price shaming people, because if you want something that someone else has, you either pay the price or you don't get the item. I mean, it's pretty simple. That is what I was trying to explain before when I said, like, it's pretty basic and logical. Like, that's kind of what I was saying. Like, if you want something that somebody else has, but you don't want to pay the price, then you're not going to get the item. It's pretty simple. So, yeah. So, anyway, price shaming is not good. I don't believe in it. I don't do it. So, yeah. I think that is pretty much it on this topic. I think the exporting topic is a bit more, in my opinion, a bit more interesting, because I guess it's interesting to me because I taught myself how to do it. So to me, it's interesting, but I think there's a bit more to talk about. This was kind of like a preface into the exporting episode, I think, because I don't know, you can't really explain exporting without importing, right? So anyways, bit of a shorter episode today, but I hope that everyone enjoyed this topic and enjoyed the episode in general, and thank you for listening.